this larger story that I'm actually going to start in the 18th century. Because what I first want to do is I want to set Great Britain up. Because even though in World War II it's really the United States, Germany, and the Soviet Union, the British obviously play a critical role. I'm not trying to diminish their role, but when you think about it from like the grand scale, the economic scale, it's really a slugfest between Japan, Germany on one side, and the United States and the Soviet Union on the other side, with Great Britain playing a major role. But the thing that leads to World War I is entirely the British Empire. And the thing that causes World War II is the outcome of World War I. So in other words, in order to understand World War II, you have to understand the British story in addition to the German story. So the place I want to start is the end of the 7 Years' War, which lasted 9 years. The British win it. And at that moment, that was critical for the British Empire. If they had lost the 7 Years' War, that was probably it for them. They would have probably never been anything more than a second-rate empire. In the end, the scale of England's thinking shifts, and they turn their eye to the rest of the world, which is what gets them into the colonies. So when they beat the French in 1763 by the skin of their teeth, they almost lost. By beating the French, what the English did was they set themselves up to become the world's dominant empire. I don't get it. How did little itty-bitty, off-the-beaten-path England somehow become a global empire? And of course, part of the solution is that they became the world's first drug dealer empire. Their first drug was tobacco. They later on upgrade to opium. But that's going to generate huge amounts of money. But the real trick that the English did was they figured out, first of all, how to assess victory and defeat in such a way that they learned how to manipulate defeats into little victories. And also in the process, they realized something critical. They could conquer a country and then transfer its wealth to England. And so 20 years after winning the 7 Years' War, which lasted 9 years, they will fight a 6-year-long battle against us, a 6-year-long war against us called the Revolutionary War, which was really a civil war. And they quit the war, even though militarily they're winning. And the reason they quit the war is because they discover something really interesting. They had the Royal Proclamation of 1763 with the Native Americans. It gave the Native Americans everything from Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi, which meant that they couldn't exploit that land. But in the meantime, the agriculture practices that they were using in Virginia and North Carolina had wrecked the soil. Maryland had wrecked the soil. So the southern colonies, which were the big cash crop colonies, were no longer productive. The Virginian soil was so ruined, in fact, that Virginia had to import tobacco by the time of the Revolution. Actually, by 1754, Virginia was already importing tobacco. So the English were no longer making money off the southern colonies, not the way they wanted to. What they realized in 1781 was if they surrendered to us, effectively the British Empire cut itself in half by land, not population, right? But in terms of square kilometers, they basically chopped the British Empire in half. It freed the British Empire to become the good guy in people's minds. They would do things like pursue the abolition of slavery. But in the meantime, it would allow us to keep slavery, terminate the relationship with the Native Americans, genocide them, steal their land, bring slavery there, and then grow tobacco and cotton on that soil. The surrender treaty that the British signed with us, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, specifically allowed the British to stay economically in the United States. So for all intents and purposes, the United States remained part of the British Empire economically. The reason that mattered was because it meant it was, for economic purposes, it was as if we had never gotten independence, which meant they could still make money off of us. So some researcher, I should have looked it up before I came, but I forgot to do it. Some researcher had done this really amazing research project where they looked at the amount of money that the British made off of us for the 75 years from 1783, when they signed the Surrender Treaty, until they finished the conquest of India in 1858. And the researcher discovered that the amount of money they made out of the United States was equal to the amount of money they spent conquering India. In other words, what the British had successfully done was figured out how to have their cake and eat it too. By splitting the empire in half, it allowed them to go grab India. India was brilliant. When the British began conquering India in the 17th century, little piece, they captured basically 2 itty-bitty little pieces on the west coast, and the next thing you know, they're just gobbling up whole chunks of India. When they start, India was 23% of the world's GDP. Basically, 1 out of every $4 being made on the planet was being made in India. India was industrialized. And what the British managed to do with India was transfer its GDP to England. When England let India go, let is a strong word. When India got its independence post-World War II, when the British realized they couldn't hold on to it any longer, India was 4% of the world's GDP. The English had so successfully plundered India that they had effectively transferred those 19 percentage points to England. That's the genius of what the English had pulled off. They had literally deindustrialized India and then industrialized England instead. So, for example, India was one of the world's largest cotton producers. The big cotton producers were the United States, right? The US South, Egypt, India. That was where most of the world's cotton was being generated. So the British end up conquering India. They've got access to that cotton even after they'd lost us. But they can still buy our cotton. It's not like we're not going to sell it to them. So they didn't really lose us. And they're still making money off of us because, for all intents and purposes, we're still hooked into their economy. Indians made their own clothing out of that cotton. So the English ban India from making its own clothing, and then they make factories in England that make that cotton clothing, and then they sell traditional Indian clothing to India. They were making traditional Indian clothing in England, and then selling it to the Indians after banning the Indians from producing their own clothing. So this is what the imperialist genius event that the English pull off that makes them the greatest empire the world had seen until us, right? We're the greatest empire.